Well, thanks for joining me for the webinar. Employer motivation has been widely researched over the last 100 years, and there are well over 1,000 studies done on it. However, I'm aware of just one study that has actually looked at a discrete group labelled as software testers, and that was part of a larger study. And that included just 31 testers, so only marginally statistically significant group of people. So in this study what we've got is currently well over 600 responses from around the world, and therefore we've got plenty of data to play with, and therefore the results can be statistically significant for even some of the roles within software testing. So what I want to cover, if I can get the thing to work, I want to introduce motivation really quickly. I'm going to speed through the background and theory of motivation and concentrate on the results of the survey. If you've got further interest, there's going to be a EuroSTAR ebook which will contain 2 white papers that describe the data that's presented in this webinar, and that'll be published in mid-May, so that's about 3 weeks away. So if I've missed something out or you want more details, get the ebook, or you can email me, and the email address will be at the end of the set of slides at some point. So I'm going to consider 2 main areas in the presentation on the motivation. What factors are best for motivating software testers, and do the generic theories that cognitive psychologists have come up with actually match those theories? And if we actually look at the different roles in software testing, should we motivate all testers the same? And basically the answer is no. What we'll actually see is that different software testing roles require different ways of motivating them. So let's start by obviously defining what I'm going to talk about motivation here, and most of you will be familiar with the concept and practicalities of motivation because it applies to you on a day-to-day basis when you're working. The definition I've given you here in red is probably closest to what I'm covering, and it contains 2 important points. The first is that motivation has 2 basic facets: internal and external, and it's much easier for us to measure and control the external factors, but of course the internal factors, as I'm sure you're aware, are just as important in actually motivating ourselves. So if we actually just look at the external factors, the things we can measure, we know that motivation links directly with productivity. So if we're employing people, having them motivated is really important. Other things, secondary perhaps, things like staff retention is higher if we have higher motivation, and absenteeism is lower. So actually having motivated employees is definitely something we need to be aware of, and as managers it's really important to us. But if we're a tester, then motivation is also important to us because we're spending a large proportion of our time doing this job, and doing a job you're motivated in is obviously far better than actually being stuck in a role that you don't want to be in. The thing is, if it's so important to managers, are they actually any good at it? And well, probably not that good, and we'll see the actual results from the survey on the management a bit later towards the end. But many managers working in IT are still stuck in using the theories that many psychologists discounted at least 50 years ago. So these are people saying, yeah, let's use a carrot and stick approach. So if we reward people with more money, they will naturally work harder, we'll get more productivity out of them. But in fact, what we actually know is that people who've done experiments on doing this have found that actually giving people rewards, higher bonuses, in the long term actually demotivates them and lowers their productivity. So not really a good way of going forward. Of course, you can use the stick, you can threaten people, make them insecure, but again, studies have shown that in the long run, again, it doesn't create higher motivated staff and better productivity. One of the things that all the theories we've got on since the carrot and stick theories is that it's not simple. It's a multifaceted problem. So there are psychological, sociological, physiological and behavioural aspects that need to be considered. So things like the way you were brought up, how comfortable your workplace is, how you're managed when you're in the workplace, and how you feel. Did you get out the right side of bed in the morning? All will affect your motivation on a typical day. So we created a questionnaire which was both paper-based and online so that we could get a higher range of people to answer. The survey took quite a while to fill in, so people who actually filled it in were quite committed. It was 40 questions. Some of them were demographics, so we could get an idea of the background of the people, where they were working, and I'll show you those results in a moment, so you get a feel for the variety and range of people who answered the survey. The questions on motivation followed a Likert scale, and on the slide there you can see a type of Likert scale, and basically we worked from strongly agree to strongly disagree on a 5-point Likert scale. We also asked some open-ended questions, so people were able to actually just tell us what they felt motivated or demotivated them, and therefore we've ended up with both qualitative and quantitative data. We got responses from around the world. Currently there's about 670 responses sitting on SurveyMonkey, plus there are some that we got through the paper-based. And what we did was we looked at these, and the results I'm showing you are based on 545 responses, which is the baseline I had at about September last year, and it's less than 600 because I discounted about 55 responses. That is because if people didn't fill in the complete 40 questions, or perhaps they answered, some people just started answering questions and they were all answered don't care. So those, if they were inconsistent, then they got discounted. The set of questions are in the slide set and in the white papers, so you can see those. There were positive and negative questions, so people couldn't keep answering definitely agree or highly disagree all the way through, because it wouldn't make sense. So they had to actually read each question, and we then interpreted them based on whether they were positive or negative. The questions were generated along with Taffleen Murnane, so thanks to Taffleen, who's, I don't know, maybe listening out in Melbourne, but my guess is she's probably asleep by now. So as you can see, the fact that I'm in Europe and Taffleen's in Australia meant that we got a balance between Europe and Australia, and we also had I visited Asia and published a couple of magazine articles out there, so we've also got a reasonable number of responses from Asia. We didn't visit North America to get and deliberately publicise it there, so therefore that accounts for the relatively low response from North America. As you can see, we had a really wide range of industry sectors, so biggest areas were finance and insurance and IT, but responses from all over, so no particular area biased over the others. People who responded worked for different types of organisation, and as you can see we end up with 5 main areas. Company sizes that people were working in, again, a wide range from the one-person company all the way up to greater than 1,000, so your multinationals included in there as well. We asked people what life cycles they were using, and the choices are shown on the screen there. One of the interesting results was only 28% of the respondents said they were working on agile projects, and normally people are quite keen to tell you they work on agile projects. So we were a bit surprised that this was so low, because many of the specialised agile surveys and the surveys done by agile tool vendors give much higher percentages of people in the industry working on agile projects. So maybe agile's not quite as widespread as some of those surveys would suggest. We had a wide range of testing roles, and the 6 main roles that you can see there, so developer tester with 25, test analysts, test leads, test managers, test consultants and heads of testing. For each of those individual roles, we've actually got enough data to make statistical analyses about the individual roles. So that means later in the presentation I'll be able to show you how we can compare each of these different roles and how maybe they're motivated or demotivated by different things. In the large group of others, we've got people such as performance testers, test automators, security testers, but not enough of any one group to make them large enough to be to do statistical analysis. For each of the different roles, we asked them what activities they performed as part of that role. And so you can see on this radar or spider chart here, this is the results from the test analyst. And what you can see here, for instance, is that 88% of test analysts were involved in test execution. 54%, a surprisingly low number, were involved in exploratory testing, whereas 76% were involved explicitly in test design. And we've got these, as you can see on the next slide here, for each of the major roles that we've actually looked at. And one of the things you can see here is that the profiles change quite dramatically as people move between the different roles. So if we're actually going to promote someone from being perhaps a test analyst to become a test lead, we have to be really aware that actually their activities they're going to perform are likely to change quite a lot. So therefore they're going to need different skills. So as you move people between these different roles, there's a really good case for actually saying, okay, but before we move the person, let's give them some training or education to make sure they've got the skills that they need to perform the different set of activities that they're likely to perform in this new role. So as you can see, as you move from test analyst to test lead, the test lead has got far more management and improvement activities. So those are both areas that you would need to give them some training in. And you can also see the test lead spends an enormous amount of their, apparently an enormous amount of time reviewing. More test leads spend their time reviewing than any of the other roles. If you look at the test manager at the bottom left of the screen there, you can see that 97% of those who declared themselves to be test managers actually were doing test management, which is nice because that confirms that there probably aren't, most people are answering sensibly. I'm not quite sure what the 3% who were test managers were doing who didn't actually do any test management, but I'm fairly happy that if only 3% of people were occasionally answering things wrong, I can probably live with that. If you look at the area covered on the radar charts for each of the different roles, you'll see that the test lead requires the widest range of skills, while the heads of testing actually require the narrowest. So actually test leads employ over 50% more range of activities than heads of testing appear to do. So going to the theory of motivation and the theories have been coming for the last 50, 60, 70 years. And the three that I'm going to concentrate on in this presentation are the motivation hygiene theory from Hertzberg in 1959, and we'll look at that towards the end. The one I'm going to concentrate on to start with is the job characteristics model, which generates a motivating potential score, and that's from 1976. We chose that one because it's by far the most popular motivation model. There's by far the most papers, which means that it's generally accepted as working across the industry. And it also is a good thing to compare against because there's lots of other data to compare it against. We went also for a much more up-to-date theory. This is the Motivation 3.0, and this is based on Daniel Pink's book from 2010 called Drive: The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. And we'll see that after we've looked at the job characteristics model. If you want details on all of these different motivation theories, it's outside the scope of this presentation, but if you get the ebook, you'll find that there are lots of references for you. So this is the benchmark question we used. As you can see exactly what the Likert scale looks like from strongly disagree up to strongly agree. And obviously our question here is highly specific to testing. And we were a bit surprised that it seems to be biased, that a lot of people are actually motivated to do the job in testing. Well, there could be some bias here because it could well be that people who are filling in a survey on motivation are actually perhaps more motivated than average, so it might be slightly biased to the right-hand side. But actually, this shape of response fits really closely with other surveys, obviously not in testing. So if it's just simply I'm highly motivated to do my job, this maps with organisations such as the US government, where they actually get all of their employees to fill in a survey every year, and it matches this really closely. So it could be that people move into jobs that they expect to be motivated in, so they've got the right job, or it could also be that once people are in a job and they're settled, they persuade themselves that actually, because they're spending so much time doing it, it must be right for them. But this is quite a nice set of results because it matches what other industries get. And if we actually look at that perceived motivation and then map it to each of the different testing roles, what we can see is basically as you get into a more senior role, it appears you get more motivated. So if you want more motivation, then I guess getting promoted is not a bad thing to do, and it will have other benefits such as getting paid more. Now, many of you will already know the theories of correlation, so I'm going to go through this really quickly, but I'm just going to cover the Pearson's correlation coefficient because that's what we've used to determine whether or not people are motivated by different factors. And the way it works is if you look at the left-hand side scatter graph there, although not at all scattered, you can see that as we increase one factor or coefficient, the other factor or coefficient goes up every time. So it means that if we increase that factor, we're guaranteed that the second factor increases also. So when we're measuring this in terms of the motivation, each of the factors we're considering, we're comparing to what people's perceived motivation was. So if we get a score of 1, over on the left-hand side, over here, then we've got a perfect correlation. So we could guarantee that by improving that factor, we would improve motivation. But of course, in the real world, it's not quite like that. So we end up with scatter graphs, less perfect lines, as we've got on the right-hand side, where we've got a very strong positive correlation. In reality, of course, we don't do it on scatter graphs. In reality, we're doing it in Excel and just running it through one of the formulae, and it gives us the results. On the left-hand side, we've got strong positive relationship between 0.4 and 0.69, and as we're gradually moving down, the relationship goes lower. We've still here got, on the right-hand side, a moderate positive relationship, and on the right-hand side here, the statistical significance of this set of data here, if we run it through the formula, we find that the actual significance is 0.02. That means that if we were to actually use this factor to motivate people, then 98 times out of 100 we would expect increasing one factor would increase the motivation. 2 times out of 100 it wouldn't. But if it's generally, if it's 5 or below, we think it's statistically significant, so that would be okay. As we get lower, these two scatter graphs are showing you data where basically it's not statistically significant. You can see Excel has actually given us a slope here, so we've got a slight or weak positive relationship, but because there are only 34 data points, there's not enough data to tell us that that is statistically significant. On the other hand, if we were to throw all of our 545 tester data into there, it would be statistically significant, because even with a weak positive relationship with 545 responses, it's actually statistically significant. If it gets below 0.2, then the relationship is so weak as we're probably not that bothered about it. Now I'm going to show you one more here, and this is because what we're going to see with the actual data where it compares the factors with what we expect to increase motivation, what we'll actually see is occasionally we're going to get negative numbers. And when we get negative numbers, this is telling us that we've actually got a negative relationship. So this might be that if we started increasing working hours and just continued to increase working hours without giving any compensation, then we would expect people to be demotivated. So we'd expect this sort of shaped graph. The thing is, we're going to see that we get some of these negative values even for the factors where the cognitive psychologists' theories are telling us that really that factor should be a motivating factor. And they're the ones that we're interested in, because if it's demotivating to testers or a particular type of tester, we have to be careful not to use it, otherwise we're going to end up demotivating people. So as I said, the first thing we're going to look at is the job characteristics model. It's been around for a long time, since 1975, and lots of data on it. And it's based on five areas. And the areas are relatively simple. So skill variety is basically saying that if within your job you do lots of different things, then the job's going to be more interesting than if you're doing a single thing repetitively. Task identity is whether or not you get to finish an activity. So task identity, people are more motivated if they can actually see that they've completed something. Task significance is how important we think the job is. So someone who's a brain surgeon is probably more likely to feel that their job is important compared to the person working perhaps sitting at the till in the canteen in the hospital. Autonomy is where people get to control who they work with, when they work, and the order in which they do things. And if you give people more control, they're generally more motivated. Feedback is when we give people positive feedback and tell them how well they're doing their job. Occasionally, if we want to, and we're giving them positive feedback, we can also slip in some positive feedback to get them to change how they're doing their job as well. Now, if we get results for each of these 5 factors, and as we'll see, they're not as simple as I've shown you there. Some of them are multifaceted. We can actually feed them into this equation here, and if each of those is scored on scale of 1 to 7, what we actually find is that the formula will give you a motivating potential score in the range between 1 and 343. Although if you had a score of 343, you would have a job that was so demanding that very, very few people in the world could actually cope with it. So what we're going to do now is look at each of these different areas, because we've got the data from each of the different factors, and see how it applies to each of the different testing roles. So here we can see that feedback is broken down into 3 different types of feedback. So there's feedback from the work itself, then there's feedback you get from your colleagues, and then there's feedback you get from your supervisor. And each of these had a different question, and as I said before, you can check what the questions are. The questions for the job characteristics model, so generating the motivating potential score, were really easy to generate because there's so much published about them. The questions are out in the public domain, and all I had to do was occasionally put the word testing in to make it absolutely relevant to testers. So if we actually look here, we can see that we get an unusual result for developer testers. We can see that developer testers appear to actually be demotivated by getting feedback from their colleagues. Well, it could be that the developer testers are just antisocial, but that's probably unlikely and unfair. So one interpretation, and I want to emphasize the fact that each of the interpretations of the data that I come up with is just my personal interpretation. The figures you're seeing on the slides are the actual data, so I can't change that. I can interpret it, so therefore it's up to you whether or not you accept my interpretation. But one interpretation of why developer testers are actually demotivated by feedback from their colleagues is that perhaps most of the feedback they get from their colleagues is in the form of, you've done something wrong. So the developer tester has written some code, and the feedback they're actually getting is that there's a bug in the code. So therefore most of the feedback they're getting from their colleagues, who presumably a lot of them would be testers, is that they've done something wrong, and therefore that demotivates them. We can see that the test leads are neither positively motivated or negatively motivated. They're sitting at such a low score here that we can't say one or the other. The rest of the group are actually positively motivated by getting feedback from their colleagues. We can see also here that heads of testing actually get far more motivated than the people in the other testing roles when they get feedback from their colleagues or their supervisors. And this could be because most people working in IT are not actually very good at giving feedback. And it's only when you get to the more senior roles, so your colleagues are therefore more senior and your supervisors more senior, that people have been trained to give feedback in a good way. And if you can give feedback in an effective way, it appears that therefore it motivates people more. And the good thing about feedback as a motivating factor is that it is relatively cheap. All you need to do is train people to be able to give the feedback well. Having done that, the cost of actually giving the feedback is a few seconds or minutes per week, and it has a really beneficial effect in terms of motivation. So moving on to variety, and as you can see, variety is variety in the different tasks you do and variety in the number of projects you work on in your job. And what you can see from the bottom one on the variety of projects, everyone likes working on lots of different projects. So giving testers jobs where they get to that work on project after project and not being left on the same project for a number of years is going to be motivating. However, you can see that we've actually got a quite unusual score again for the developer testers here, and you can see that developer testers are actually demotivated by having a variety of tasks to perform. So one interpretation of this is that actually they like doing programming because they're developers, and if you force them to also do testing as well, so you increase the variety of tasks, they don't like doing that. So if they're considering testing as being one of the add-ons that adds variety that they don't want to do, then they actually get demotivated, and actually what they far prefer to do is just be left to purely do programming. Significance is how important the job is, and there are two facets to this. Does it affect colleagues, and does it affect the results of the project? And again, we can see here that the developer testers are challenged by the fact that what they're doing is going to affect anything. If it affects their colleagues, they're highly demotivated, and if it affects the project, they're highly demotivated. So I guess this is because the developer testers are actually aware that when they make mistakes, if the bugs aren't actually found, it's bad news. So telling developer testers that what they're doing is really important, you have to be really careful with, because the more they perceive what they're doing to be highly significant and affecting other people and affecting the project is demotivating for them. Overall, we can see that significance as a whole is not especially a strong motivator for testers in general. It's not scoring highly, it's only really for the test consultants. It's getting over that bar of actually being significant. So significance, although it's part of the general theories of motivation, doesn't appear to work especially well for testers. Identity, being able to actually complete a whole task, and that's either complete a project or complete in separate task within a project. You can see that for the consultants and the heads of testing, it isn't especially motivating. In fact, it's demotivating some of the time. And this might well be because if you're a consultant or you're a head of testing, then actually completing something isn't what drives you. Most of the time, if you're a consultant, you're coming up with advice. If you're a head of testing, you're delegating to other people and telling them what you want them to do. And so for both of those roles, because they're not actually performing and completing the tasks or completing the projects themselves, to them that is not important, and it's definitely not motivating. You can see here that the developer testers find it definitely demotivating if they are having to complete their tasks, and this could well be because they feel that for them to say that they've actually completed their task, they've actually had to meet not only the programming requirement, but actually have unit tested to meet some unit test completion criterion, which they're apparently, according as these figures may suggest, they find demotivating. So autonomy, as you can see, has got four facets to it, so one of the more complex factors, and what we can see is that as far as autonomy is concerned, test leads have a distinct problem. It's not an especially high score that it's demotivating, but it's definitely different from all the others. And this could be because when you're in the role of a test lead, you have very few options about what you do next. Because if you're a test lead and the test analysts who are working for you finish something, they immediately need it reviewed. And therefore, you have no option. You can't say, oh, I think I'll leave that a few days, because you're holding up the process. And the test leads are having to follow a process that basically they have very little control over. And therefore, they're just following the process. Work comes in, they know what they have to do, and they have few options. One of the strange things about these results looking at the working hours, and I was expecting most of the people to actually want and be motivated by being able to control what working hours they worked. So obviously being able to decide that you get in late and perhaps leave later is something that motivates the heads of testing, but as far as each of the other roles is concerned, really insignificant. So it's not something, if you're a head of testing and you do think it's important, you have to recognize that it's not something you can use to motivate the people who are working for you, because it is not an especially motivating factor for them, even though it is for you. So if we join all of the scores from our 545 respondents who completed the questionnaires, and we feed them into the formula, and we then compare what the formula tells us for motivating potential score and compare it with the perceived motivation, we get these results. And I've not drawn it as a scatter chart, because if I draw the results as a scatter chart, lots of the points overlay each other, which is why I've drawn it here as a bubble diagram. And the bigger the bubble means the more results at the center of that bubble. And what you can see here is that we get a correlation of 0.4, and that's a strong positive relationship. And with 545 results, that is absolutely statistically significant. One of the strange things that is a bit concerning is if we actually draw a line at 60, so this is a motivating potential score of 60 shown there. What you can see is that if you quite a few of the testers were scoring below 60. Now I mentioned the other study that had actually covered software testers that had looked at motivation, and the quote from that paper on people who scored less than 60 for any of the jobs in IT was that how could anyone believe that a job below 60 could keep the simplest human being occupied? But apparently it is for quite a few of these software testers. So I guess a bit worrying, a bit surprising, and let's hope they're getting paid well. If we look at the MPS scores for the different roles, we can see, as you'd expect, given the correlation with perceived motivation, it increases as before with seniority. So the more senior you are, according to MPS, the more motivated you're going to be. So the second theory, which we'll briefly look at because it's only actually got 3 areas and we've already looked at autonomy, is Daniel Pink's Motivation 3.0. So basically Daniel Pink's theory is that you're motivated if you have autonomy, which we've looked at before. You also want a job that requires mastery. And mastery is having a job that is continually challenging you, but in a good way, so not challenging you so that you can't actually finish things. And also a job that has a higher or greater purpose than just making a profit for the organisation. So that's having a job where maybe the organisation has some commitment to the wider community. So feeling that your job really matters. So mastery, as you can see here, is not simply having a challenge. It's having activities that challenge you. It's also, and as you can see with the activities that challenge you, it appears that the more senior you get, the more you like to be challenged. So heads of testing here and consultants and test managers, all really highly motivated by being given a challenge. But so also test analysts and test leads, but just not so much. Now, these are the really surprising ones for mastery. The question here is basically, have you mastered all the skills you need to do the job? And the theory behind mastery would say that people never want to have mastered every skill, because if they've mastered every skill, there's nothing new to learn. But it appears that heads of testing don't like to admit that there ever isn't anything they can't do that's part of their job, because they would be very strongly demotivated if they had to admit that there were any skills that they hadn't mastered to do their job. So therefore, that one doesn't fit in for testers, and especially heads of testing. Purpose: this is the job having something that is of benefit to the wider community, and as you can see, all but the test analysts are motivated by thinking that what they're doing is for the benefit of the people outside their company as well as the company. Now, what we can also see down here is that heads of testing appears are demotivated if the organisation is actually feeding money out into the community as well. So what you can see here is it appears that heads of testing are demotivated if the organisation isn't very strongly aligned with making a profit. And that could well be because heads of testing, being more senior, are actually in the position where they hold shares, and therefore the organisation making a profit is really strongly tied to their personal benefit. One of the areas that isn't in either of the models that we've looked at is the working environment. But we asked about this because we believed it was important and something that was missing from the other theories. And you can see here that the working environment scores very strongly, and in fact it's a statistically positive correlation with motivation for every one of the different roles. So being able to set up a nice working environment will motivate everyone, no matter what role they're on. But it's actually missing from the generic theories. We know, of course, that these theories are based on the idea that no single factor will motivate everyone. So what we can see here is the size of the bubbles corresponds to the correlation with motivation. So if we're going to try motivating people, and we can't choose every one of these, then let's choose the ones that give us the biggest benefit, depending of course on how much it's going to cost us to do that. And what we can see here is if we're doing MPS, then it's those 5 factors that we need to be looking at, and we can see that significance and identity are not scoring very highly there. If it's Daniel Pink's motivation 3.0, then it's mastery, autonomy and purpose. So it's those 3 that we're looking at. And if we actually compare the different scores with their relationship with motivation, we can see that MPS from 1975 and MAP from 2010 score very, very similarly if we look at it across the whole range of software testing roles. We can also see that if we drop significance and identity and we just choose the 5 top factors, so we do a combination of MPS and MAP, then we actually get a higher score down here of 0.44. If we, as some would consider, cheat and actually look at the scores for each of the factors and choose the ones that score highest and then come up with a new measure, which I have unimaginatively labelled the top 4. So we've chosen the top 4 factors here. So this is working environment. This is variety 2 is getting to work on a variety of different projects. This is having a job that challenges and stretches me. And mastery 3 is actually having a job where I get so engaged in it that I lose track of time. Then if we actually just put those 4 factors together, then we get a score across everyone of 0.5. And that means we only have to consider those 4 factors to get that level of correlation, which is really high. So those are the 5 factors where we actually create the combination that we saw here, gives us a score of 0.444. Now, I also looked at the data, and we've got data that tells us which regions people come from, and what we can see here is that I've actually got all the results for those 4 areas of, well, 4 ways, those 4 models, and I've compared the Asian testers against everyone. As you can see, for MPS, it actually is really close. And in fact, it's only for Daniel Pink's Motivation 3.0 that there is any large difference between the 2. So this basically tells us 2 things. One of the things it tells us is that actually autonomy is actually slightly different for Asians than it is for non-Asian testers, and therefore you would need to be aware of that if we were to look at the scores in real detail. And the other thing to look at is actually the differences between Asian testers and the rest of the testers is generally much smaller than it is between the different testing roles. Therefore, it's more important to focus your motivation on what role people are in than what country or what part of the world people are from. The third theory that we looked at was Hertzberg's hygiene model, and Hertzberg's hygiene model works on the idea that up until he came up with this model, or this theory, people thought that the things that motivated you were the opposite of the things that demotivated you. And Hertzberg said, actually, what you've got to do is actually remove the things that demotivate people, and then once you've done that, you can then motivate people, which argues that the factors that motivate you and demotivate you are actually 2 different sets of things, or different sets of factors. And, well, we actually asked an open question for this, which is, as Hertzberg originally did, he actually interviewed people and asked them, and then subsequently other researchers have got people to fill in questionnaires where they had open-ended questions. And what you can see is at the top there, being challenged is the highest motivating factor. Getting good feedback is the next highest. Now, the other thing we can see is that money only comes in at number 5 with 7% of the people. Good management comes in at number 8 with 5% of the people. If we actually now put the demotivating factors in, however, we can see that bad management is your really high demotivator. So having bad management in there is demotivating 1/5 of the people, or 1/5 of the people find that the most demotivating thing. The nice thing for feedback and appreciation is that it comes number 2 on both. Therefore, if we have to actually spend some money and effort actually trying to motivate people and remove the demotivation, that is an area where it is really worth spending the money. And speaking of money, it is only at number 10 as a demotivating factor. So not getting enough money, only 3% of the people thought that was a demotivating factor. From the 545 respondents, we got about 950 or so opinions on what motivated and demotivated them. Not one of them said beer motivated them. None of them said pizza. 1 out of 950 thought cake was motivating for them. In red here you can see that testers, well, 5% of the testers actually find the developers are demotivating, although I guess we don't have much to do if we have no developers. We looked earlier and saw that not so many people worked on Agile as might be expected. If we actually look at how motivation changed for the people working on in different life cycles, we get these results. Now, one of the surprising things here is that we were expecting the people working on Agile projects to be far more motivated than perhaps people working on maintenance projects over here on the right. But what you can see is that actually there is no statistical difference between any of these 5 areas. So what life cycle you're in, it doesn't matter. That isn't, for most people anyway, that is not the reason you're either motivated or demotivated. Similarly, organisational size, again, there is no significant difference between the motivation in the different organisation sizes. If we look at experience levels, we get the same thing again. Again, statistically, there's no significant difference depending on how long you've been working in testing. And there is no significant difference depending on what sort of organisation you work in. So again, there's no point moving from one sort of organisation to another, because in general that's not going to make a significant difference to the motivation. What we can see is that tester education down here on the right hand side has no correlation with salary. In fact, we actually got a negative number here. So having higher educational qualifications, and I'm talking education here, not qualifications such as ISTQB, so I'm talking about degree level, master's level, PhD level, does not affect tester salary in our group anyway. And the education also has no effect on motivation. On the other hand, tester salary is highly correlated with tester experience, as you'd expect. So the longer you've been testing, the more you get paid for doing it. These other lines don't really get over 0.2, well, don't get over 0.2, so therefore not a strong correlation. One last point, if you want to be more motivated, and you can see here for every one of the roles, you can see the green bar is higher than the red bar. The green bar is the level of motivation for people who've got outside interests. So that is, they do testing, but not in their normal workplace. They do other things like write blogs, speak at conferences, run special interest groups, whatever. Those people are consistently higher motivated, and there is a statistical, this is statistically significant. So if you want to get more motivated, do something outside your normal job. And also, if you're employing a tester, look for testers who've got these outside interests. They'll be more motivated and therefore, hopefully, more productive, higher retention, less absenteeism. So the conclusions. The generic theories that have been around a long time, some of them, and some of them less so, actually work for testing. But now we know how it changes for testers, so we know that significance and identity aren't so important for testers. We can now actually do better. So testers are a special case, as you would expect. And here's a list of the most motivating factors. And at the top there, and this is generic for all testers, as it says, this is not role by role, generically, this working environment by far the most effective way of increasing motivation, as long as you can do it within reasonable costs. We also know that testers love feedback, and this is a win-win scenario because it both increases motivation and decreases demotivation, and it also is relatively cheap to do. It probably just needs a bit of training for on the part of supervisors to make sure they can give good feedback. If we actually consider testing as being in a number of different roles, we've seen that testers perform quite different activities depending on what role they're in. So therefore, as we move people between different roles, as we move them from test analyst to test lead and test lead to test manager, we need to give them training and education. We can also see that the testing discipline is varied. People do very different activities depending on what role we're in. So we shouldn't just treat testing as a homogeneous group. It's a proper discipline. It's got lots of different roles, and those different roles have different goals and do different activities, and as we've seen, are motivated and demotivated by different factors. So therefore we need smarter approaches that take into account the role that people are actually performing. And we've also seen that there is a slight difference on how testers are motivated in different regions of the world, but it is actually far smaller than the differences between the roles. So it should be a secondary focus after we've considered what roles people are performing. Personally, so for you individually, you can help yourselves make your job more interesting. You're going to spend an enormous proportion of your time doing it, so you might as well enjoy it. So what you can do is you can look at the benchmarks. You can see the benchmarks for motivating potential score. You can answer the questions for motivating potential score for yourselves, generate your score, identify areas where you're scoring low, and consider those as potential areas for improving your motivation. Now, I used to work in the education sector for about 18 years, and does it have an effect on a tester? Well, for the people responding to this survey, no. So that's a bit sad. You'd hope that education would make people, or better education, would make people better testers. It could well be that education covers testing so poorly that it doesn't have an effect. Hopefully, as the discipline matures, this will change. And finally, if you've got outside interests, it's a benefit to you and anyone employing you. Okay, and that's it. So if you've got any questions, please go to Test Huddle.